type of photography equipment that a photographer chooses to work with is very much a personal choice. A lot of times it just depends on what kinds of subjects you like to cover or how you like to work. What I'd like to do in this video is show you some of my equipment, show you how I use some of that, and hopefully give you some ideas on what type of system you'd like to build for yourself. Over the years, I've acquired quite a bit of equipment. I am a camera collector, but I like to use most of the cameras and lenses to experiment with different effects. I've spent a lot of time researching and thinking about each piece of equipment before purchase, finding out what will best suit my needs. When I started out years ago in film photography, I started out with a Pentax K1000 and a very simple setup. Through the years, I added different kinds of equipment to that system until I built up a small, effective system of lenses and accessories. In 2010, I switched over to the Canon EOS system for my regular working gear. When I did this, I tried to get similar lenses to my Pentax system. Because different kinds of cameras have different sensor formats, this will affect how different focal lengths look on a certain kind of camera. A full-frame digital camera has the sensor the same size as 35mm film. However, an APS-C, or sometimes called a crop frame sensor, will crop in on any given focal length, making it appear more telephoto. After many years of using the Canon Rebel XTI, I soon moved up to a more professional Canon 7D. This was an APS-C size sensor, but it was a much better built camera, having more weather sealing and more professional build quality. I still use this camera quite often for macro shots and some wildlife. Whereas I was really happy with the quality of the Canon 7D, one thing I was missing was being able to use wide-angle lenses at their native focal length. So a few years later, I upgraded to a Canon 6D. This is a full-frame 35mm camera that takes full advantage of the wide-angle focal lengths. A really great thing about full-frame cameras is that the sensor, being larger, uses larger pixels as well. This usually results in a cleaner, noise-free image. This is still probably my favorite and probably most used landscape camera. My most current camera is the Canon EOS R5. This is a mirrorless camera, which means that they've completely eliminated the mirror box, which makes for a smaller, more compact design. They've also replaced the pentaprism that's in most DSLRs with just an electronic viewfinder. Whereas I still prefer the optical viewfinder in a DSLR, there are many benefits to mirrorless cameras, one of them being faster frame rates. Also, you get better autofocus and tracking. The focus peaking on manual focus is also a great addition. When shooting video, the electronic viewfinder also allows for full-time viewing. This means that as you're shooting, you can actually look through there and see the animal as you're shooting it. This is actually quite an improvement over what DSLRs would do, because when filming with them, you'd have to actually look at the LCD panel on the back of the camera. Another great advantage of using mirrorless cameras is that because of the shorter flange distance, it allows for adapting all sorts of non-Canon lenses with the use of different kinds of converters. Lately, one of my more favorite things is converting a lot of my old vintage Pentax lenses to my Canon system. So what kind of lenses do I use on my cameras? I have both a mixture of fixed focal length lenses and zoom lenses. However, when I'm using a zoom lens, I'm generally thinking of it in the way of a fixed lens that I can then use to crop in or out. For me, that's just a very convenient way of looking at it. The lens I use most for landscapes is my Canon 17 to 40 millimeter zoom lens. This was actually one of the first lenses I bought when I got into Canon lenses. And I chose this one because it worked really well on both the crop frame and full frame cameras. Being a non-IS lens, it's not exactly the most modern of Canon lenses, but it really works very well for pretty much all situations having to do with landscape. When compactness and lightweight is a concern, that's when I reach for my Canon 40mm STM pancake lens. As you can see, even though it's the same focal length as the 17 to 40 at its long end, it's much smaller and more compact. This is a great lens to have just by itself, or if I have a very large lens and I still want to take some landscapes, I usually will include this in the bag. Whereas the 50mm focal length is considered more normal or standard for 35mm size, 40mm is more like a wide angle. When I need a super ultra wide angle lens, that's when I turn to my Rokinon 14mm. This lens is an off-brand lens, not made by Canon, but it does have a Canon mount. However, Rokinon does make this lens in other mounts. This is a fully manual focus lens, but it's quite fast at f2.8. I find this lens most useful in astrophotography. One of my next most used lenses is the Canon 28 to 135mm lens. This lens is very versatile because it starts at 28mm wide angle and goes all the way out to a short telephoto at 135mm. Even though this lens is of an older design, it is an IS lens having image stabilization. Because of its broad focal length range, it's a great travel lens. One of my favorite subjects is macro photography. And years ago, I discovered that if you use a telephoto macro lens, this isolates the subject and makes a very pleasing background. The lens I use is the Canon EF 100mm macro. This is an older version of the lens, and there's newer versions available. But as far as I'm concerned, 100mm macro is probably one of the best focal lengths to use. Moving a little further up the focal length scale, we come to my next biggest lens, the Canon 300mm f4 telephoto. Again, this is an older version lens without IS, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have its usefulness. It's very sharp and very accurate. And because it's an f4 lens, this makes it very compact and carryable. Going deeper into the telephoto range, we come to my next lens, the Canon 400mm f5.6. This lens is also non-IS because it's of an older design. However, this is actually my favorite lens as far as telephotos go. It's extremely sharp. And again, because it's a slower speed, 5.6 in this case, it makes it very compact. If I need a lot of focal length but don't want to carry very much, this is a great lens to turn to. When I absolutely need the very most focal length that I can possibly get, that's when I turn to my biggest lens, the Canon EF 500mm f4. Now, a lot of people think that with a huge telephoto lens, this means you can stand on a mountainside somewhere and take a picture of a bear all the way across a valley or something like that. It just doesn't quite work that way. A lot of times you still have to be very close. Big lenses like this are more for really getting close when you're already close to get those tight portraits. And really, this lens mostly shines because of its f4 aperture. This means that I can really isolate the subject and blur out the background. It also means that in very low light conditions, I can keep shooting action shots of wildlife and keep my ISO very low to keep my quality up. I like to experiment in my photography a lot of times, and this brings us to this lens, which technically isn't really a lens at all. This is a pinhole lens made by a company called Thingify. Pinhole lenses differ from other lenses in that, well, basically, they don't have any glass in them at all. Simply put, they're a drilled hole in a piece of metal. Now you can make your own pinhole, but there are several commercially made pinhole lenses out there. This one is made very precisely with a laser drilled hole. Now the focal length of this one is approximately 37 millimeters, so it's sort of a slightly wide angle lens. The thing about pinholes is that because of the extremely small aperture, you're bending the light through that small hole and getting extreme amounts of depth of field. But because there's no glass involved, there's nothing to really focus the light. Therefore, the image ends up being quite soft. But this gives the image a little bit more of an abstract look, very long exposures and kind of a surreal look to them. And that's kind of what I'm going for. Pinhole images are really kind of a throwback to the very early days of photography. A few of my cameras have a built-in pop-up flash. However, when I really need a good, powerful flash, that's when I turn to my Canon Speedlight 430EX Mark II flash. This is a fairly basic flash that can be attached by the camera's hot shoe or off camera with a sync cord. At times, even when you're using some of the bigger telephoto lenses, it's still not quite enough focal length. This is when teleconverters, sometimes called teleextenders, can be used. The concept is very simple. It's basically an optic that you put in between your telephoto and your camera. This multiplies the power of the telephoto by whatever the power is of the teleconverter. I happen to have a 1.4 teleconverter. This means that whatever lens I put it on, it turns it into a power that's 1.4 times more. For example, if I place it between my camera and my 300mm lens, it makes that 300mm lens appear as if it's a 420mm lens. The drawback to teleconverters, however, is that they also slow the speed of the lens down by that same factor. The 1.4 teleconverter slows lenses down approximately one stop. This means that even though I have a 420mm lens, it's now slowed down to 5.6. But if you're in a bind and you really need the extra focal length, it's a great little accessory to have in your bag. When I first started out in photography, one of the first accessories I bought was an extension tube set. Extension tubes are basically hollow tubes that are spacers that you put between your camera and your lens. The space that's created between the lens and camera make the lens actually focus closer. This works for regular lenses or macro lenses, or even telephoto lenses. It doesn't matter. Any lens that you place it behind, it makes it focus closer. Most extension tube sets come in a set of 3, usually something like 12mm, 20mm, and 36mm. However, you can rearrange these in different combinations so that you can adjust the amount of extension. And because the tubes have no optics at all, you get a direct representation of what your lens is actually shooting. So the better the quality of the original lens, the better the image will actually be. A set of extension tubes is a great way to start in the macro world. I don't often use filters, but when I do, they usually are either exposure correction, color correction, or for protection. Most of the filters I use are screw-in filters, and I have an array of step-up rings to adapt them to different size filter threads on the lens. The most basic filter I have is a UV filter. Sometimes called skylight filters, these filter out UV light and some haze in the atmosphere. While many people like to permanently attach these filters to their lenses, I usually don't use them unless I'm specifically using them to protect the lens from the elements such as blowing sand or salt spray from the ocean. A very important filter that I like to use is a polarizer. Polarizers are used to deepen the colors and contrast of the sky and to remove glare from shiny objects such as water surfaces or wet vegetation. Have you ever noticed how shooting in the shade turns your images blue? I used to use an 81B warming filter a lot with film. It's helpful in correcting the temperature of a shaded scene to bring it back to more of a neutral tone. With processing programs available, this is a filter that you really don't need to use anymore, but I usually keep one around in case I want to correct the scene in camera. I haven't yet made the move to convert one of my cameras into infrared, so for the time being, I've been using this R72 infrared filter. You get a lot of the same effects, albeit with a major drawback of the fact that the filter is so dense, it steals about 12 stops of light. You can use this as a creative advantage though, by searching out subjects that can benefit from the long exposures required. The major advantage of using an infrared filter is that it's an easy and cheap way to experiment in infrared photography without paying for a full camera conversion. Most of my intentional long exposures are done by using low ISOs, small apertures, and low lighting conditions. For those times when I'm wanting a long exposure in brighter light, or if I want a super abstract long exposure, that's when I use a neutral density filter. The one I have cuts down the exposure by 10 stops, usually sending the exposure times into the multi-seconds or minutes range. This image of an aspen grove was photographed using both a neutral density filter and an infrared filter stacked together to get a very long exposure of 10 minutes, giving it a very abstract appearance. Similar to the neutral density filter, I have a graduated neutral density filter. This 100mm rectangular filter fits into a special holder and can be positioned in front of the lens to cut the light in a specific side of the image. This is very useful in cutting the light in the sky while retaining the correct exposure in the foreground. When it comes to the subject of photo equipment, nothing can be complete without talking about the backpacks that you carry your photo equipment in. This is one of the first backpacks that I owned. I still use it quite a bit, usually for when I'm carrying a lot of stuff. And this is an old Tamrac model 787. It's an old design, very simple. Just has a lot of compartments, a lot of pockets up here. It's, well, when it was new, it was pretty weatherproof. You have to kind of put on some weatherproof and everything. But backpack designs are great for when you want to carry a lot of equipment around in the wilderness. Having this weight distribution really helps. When I first started out, I used a shoulder pack, and I found out real quick that was not the way to do it. So backpack designs are usually really good. Now, that's for when I want to carry a lot of equipment. My day-to-day is this one. This is a Lowepro sling pack, and it's basically just a backpack with just one strap that goes around, and it just kind of flings open like that. It's got the compartments inside. This is for when I want to use for, just very small, lightweight stuff, if I just want to take a few items. When I know what I'm going to be photographing, which is pretty much the way I work these days, I used to carry everything, trying to make it all work. Now, these days, being older, I only carry a little bit. I just try to plan my trip a little bit better. I try to, think about what I'm going to be taking pictures of that day. And for that, this works really well. But both these backpacks have been great, and I know I'm going to get many more years of use out of them. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it helps a little bit in trying to figure out what kind of equipment that you would like to form into your own system. So until next time, I'll see you on the trail. Oh yeah, there's also this.